Welcome back to the Goblin Curse of Hamlin. I'm author Dan Allen. I was just listening to Bridget the Bunny and Davy the Dragon talking about what happened in Chapter 7. There was this notice posted on the door of the chapel in Hamlin that announced a tournament. What could it be about, yeah? Let's find out. Chapter 8, The Tournament. The priest continued reading as quickly as he could discern the letters. A tournament has been set by His Royal Highness Leopold II, Duke of Hanover, in order to discover a worthy heir to wed his daughter, the Princess Duchess Anna Marie. The royal words stunned Tobias, as the gathered crowd gasped and shouted. Some cried, "What was that?" And others answered, "A tournament to wed the princess." Ecclesiasticus had to raise his voice over all the calls and shouting. "It is hereby proclaimed by the Duke that whatsoever man or gentleman desires to wed his daughter, let him prove his worth in this manner, that he knows well the lands of the fiefdom, that he handles well the weapons of war, that his courage and determination lead him to best all others. Therefore, let each challenger begin at the castle of Hanover at dawn on the 27th day of April to hunt upon the Duke's land and return by sunset on April the 29th. Bearing his trophy, and the Duke shall judge what man has won the hunt, and that man shall have the hand of his daughter to be wed on the 1st of May of the very same year." "A 3-day hunting tournament upon the Duke's land," the brewer declared. "Alas, I'm already married," cried the carpenter. His wife beat upon him with a broom handle while the rest laughed. "I will enter," bellowed a brawny youth, several years older than Tobias, "and I shall win." "Eh," mocked a scorner, "but what if we shall send a piper? The princess eyed him well." Tobias shook his head and turned from the crowd, his feet leading themselves. "It's lost already," he whispered to himself. "I cannot win a hunting tournament." Tobias had never learned the bow and arrow. He had only hunted for vegetables in the forest, and thankfully never found a wild boar to face with his toy wooden spears. Hope dying like the summer grass under the autumn frost, Tobias fell into a miserable despair. Any hope of marrying the princess, no matter how distant, was now gone. But the piper had to admit that the Duke had kept with his tradition. All appointed posts, as you well know, were earned by contests, be they courtiers or criers, or washwomen or counselors. Some contest of speed or shouting or washing or riddles gave each a winner, and to each winner his post, which he must defend from challengers. But this fairness, that all comers had an equal chance, made his fate even worse. To rule the fiefdom, one must know the land and be able to lead the army in battle, and must also be brave and determined. After all, a duke's first duty was to protect the people. Tobias sat upon a log overlooking the river. He berated himself for allowing into his heart such feelings of romance for the princess. But perhaps, like a sliver of wood under the skin, when these feelings were rooted out, he would feel better. The trouble was, he felt as if the sliver were never quite out, for try as he might, the thought of the princess in another man's arms pricked him and needled all his senses. "Why?" he shouted angrily at the river. Its answer was to continue heedlessly downstream. An hour later, Tobias's anger had passed, but still his heart ached that there was such a tournament. A peasant might win a princess. Tobias had no skill in hunting, though he knew the forest as well as any. As a hunter of the wood's green prizes, Tobias knew the game paths where one might find any herb for remedies, or for flavoring soups. But what could that do against the great hunters of the realm, whose bowstrings were so taut that Tobias couldn't even draw them, though he was already a man by most people's reckoning? The hunters were nearly beasts themselves, seemingly part wolf. Some boasted in taking prey with their knives only, others with their bare hands. The only thing I can capture are goblin children. As the day drew on and the sun grew tired and leaned down in the sky, Tobias's mind kept on thinking of how he might win the tournament and earn the hand of the Princess Duchess, Anna Marie. Though his heart could not believe, yet his mind could not give up. So he spent out the day pacing the fields and the riverbank, never once stopping for food or drink. And even the stars were above him, and the air became chill. He shivered against the dampness of the night. So yet he wandered on, deeper into the forest, his mind bent on one thing: the tournament. The more he thought on it, the more his heart took courage. For though idea after idea passed in and out of his head, yet he knew that one trait required by the Duke he possessed: determination. "I will show my determination by never giving up," Tobias said, with the fir and ash trees of the forest as his only witnesses. "I will walk this forest until I know how I may capture the greatest prize of all. If I have any love for Anna Marie, I will try. To quit would be treason of the heart, even if the end was unalterable." That night, Tobias forsook the village of Hamlin. Instead, he lived and walked among the trees of the forest, learning to spend the nights under boughs of fir trees for insulation against the cold. And assuredly, it was yet cold. Each spring morning there was frost upon the ground around him. He learned to wait patiently upon the earth, scarcely breathing, for many hours until the deer of the forest came past without noticing him. And once he spied a goblin, he thought, in the very early morning, moving through the forest floor low to the ground as fast as a chased squirrel. Living in the forest in spring is difficult, as few plants are blooming, so Tobias was forced to set traps to catch his meals. But as yet, he had only snared one goose and a few rabbits with traps made of bent branches and strings of bark, and landed some fish with bugs as bait. Times were hard. Soon he was very hungry, with no food, and he was more than a day's journey from Hamlin, with not the strength to get there to ask for help. Exhaustion stole all courage and valor from Tobias's limbs. He collapsed upon the ground with no hope for escaping his plight. Frustration and hunger drained his will from the marrow of his bones. His hands shook slightly as he rolled onto his back and covered his eyes. "I shall die in this place," he thought, or whispered aloud. He couldn't tell. He had been alone for so many days he'd lost the sense of whether he was speaking or silent, as hermits do who've gone crackers from isolation. But Tobias remembered his oath that he would not give up. Furthermore, he remembered the good example of his sister in praying when times were hard, so Tobias got upon his knees and, for the first time in many weeks, spoke out a prayer to God, filling it with his whole soul. It was a prayer for food and for a way to earn the hand of the princess. The wind stirred in the trees, and somehow Tobias knew his prayer had been answered. Feeling some peace in his heart, Tobias regained his wits and began to notice things that had been invisible to him moments before. The ground is crawling with insects. Thereupon, he remembered the story of John the Baptist from the Bible, who was raised by eating locusts. So when the piper began to ferret out grubs wriggling under the bark of a fallen tree, he ate them with a grateful heart, and only a bit of a grimace at the bitter crunch and squish of the insect's flesh between his teeth. Drinking afterward from rainwater trapped in the depression of a boulder, Tobias felt much refreshed, and the piper took out his pipes to play. A strange song came from the flutes, not a melody to please the peasants, or for dancing or singing, but a wandering tune of off rhythms and soft parts and pauses. Tobias played on with notes wistful and still, trilling and wavering and so on, making the song of the woods, with his pipe and playing particularly upon the high notes, which he himself could not hear, but only imagine. Thus, without knowing, Tobias wrought a bit of magic, not a mystical magic, but a musical magic, lost to humans who dwell in villages. Quite soon the critters of the forest took heed and stopped to listen. A rabbit lay upon its paws, not 3 feet from Tobias, just like you're doing, Bridget. A jay landed on his very shoulder, entranced by the spell of the piper's piping. But that very night something even more grand came to pass, and this you shall hear. For day gave way to night, and all its dark changes. The shadows crept from behind each tree trunk and crawled out from underneath all the stones in the clearing. Tobias had not, as usual, made for himself a bed of boughs, or found a cleft under a rock in which to hide himself against the evening chill. Thus, without a torch to light his way, Tobias pushed and felt his way through the trees and brush along a forgotten game path, looking for a small cave in the hillside that he had spied whilst there was still light playing between the branches of the forest. By then the air was cold. It made his knuckles ache and his nose run. But even while he avoided brambles only after first finding them with his face, and blew upon his hands to ward off numbness, a sense of possibility buoyed his spirits. All shall not end in vain. There is some magic in love. But saying the words aloud exposed their emptiness. The tournament was only a few nights hence, and Tobias as yet had no means to secure a most grand prize, such as would win the princess. Tobias tucked his fingers into his armpits to warm them, and whispered encouragement to himself. "Take courage, Piper of Hamlin." The moon was nearly full, and the sky was open with starlight streaming through the new-leafed branches. Was it the moonlight that saved Tobias? From those branches, a shadow dropped, landing soundlessly to one side of Tobias. The movement caught his attention, and Tobias turned and crouched low. The image of a fleeting form conjured thoughts of a lithe and gangly figure. A shadow moving? A goblin, perhaps. Tobias raised himself up. "Leffler?" With a hiss, the shadow flung itself at Tobias, soaring over his head and rolling behind him to disappear in the brush. Tobias turned and pulled his carving knife from its leathern sheath, but as he did, a strange scent filled his nostrils. A sense of calm drifted through his limbs, and the world came into a slowness of motion, like the effects of bitter ale and the delirium of many sleepless nights. Confusion rushed into his mind. No action seemed doable. No defense seemed worthwhile. Tobias fell to one knee from the effects of the noxious odor, putting his hand to his head to steady him. The shadow rose again, and closed the short distance between them. "Devil foe!" Tobias shouted. "What poison breath is this which saps my strength?" A pale face loomed in front of him, framed by locks of youthful black hair and round blackball eyes. It answered him with a cruel laugh. But that was drowned out by a growl which rose into a thunderous bellow that echoed in Tobias's ears as the grays and blacks of the trees and ground sky swirled. The pale face of the attacker, that deathly thin shadow, was replaced by an immense mass of fur. Branches snapped and paws thumped. The shadowy figure flitted away into the trees, fleeing the bellowing creature. It was a bear. Tobias knew that with a surety that chilled his bones. Still reeling with delirium and numb from head to toe, Tobias struggled to his feet. His knife had fallen from his hands in his confusion. Having chased away the demon, the bear turned toward Tobias and reared up, towering over him. Tobias had indeed found the cleft in the rock he had been looking for. It was the home of a mother bear. The Hamliner's hands searched desperately for his short blade in leaf-covered soil, a meager weapon against the behemoth. But his nimble fingers found instead his pipe. His foot was standing upon the blade of his knife. He could have thrown the wooden pipes at the bear, but even a kindergartner knows hitting a bear with the flute pipes is rather silly. But in fact, getting this weapon was the very answer to his heart-sung prayer, for something wonderful happened then. Magical and strange. Tobias played the angry bear to sleep with his magic song. Now you might imagine that this encounter was so frightful that Tobias immediately set off for home and safe shelter. But that is not what happened at all. Having braved so many dangers in the course of one night, after his prayer and finding food and everything else, Tobias took courage. If he could face a demon with vaporous poison breath and survive hunger and bear attacks, he might even have a chance at winning the tournament. So he immediately set out for Hanover and continued his travel through the day. After resting on the Sabbath and filling his belly with soups of boiled herbs and some nuts he raided from squirrels' hoards, he came back upon a road that led toward Hanover. And it was the 26th of April, the day before the tournament was to begin. That's the end of this chapter. Join us next time for Chapter 9 of the Goblin Curse of Hamlin. I'm author Dan Allen. Thanks for joining us.